Lesson 5.4 Post-War Trends. Life after World War I brought about many changes. As soldiers came home and looked for work, women and minorities lost jobs they'd occupied during the war. The cost of living doubled, which caused suffering everywhere. In response to hard times, many Americans embraced the ideas of nativism and isolationism. Instead of wanting to prove national strength and power, Americans wanted to retreat from the world and avoid global affairs. Foreigners weren't trusted, and a general air of distrust settled over the nation. At the end of World War I and the events of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, communists, socialists, and anarchists were greatly feared by the American public. Americans began to fear the possibility of a similar revolution as civil liberties were ignored and people were punished for expressing their opinions. This feeling of panic lasted until 1920. Part of the Red Scare included the Palmer Raids. During World War I, a series of bomb attacks on court buildings, police stations, churches, and homes attributed to violent immigrant anarchist groups occurred. With President Wilson's approval, these groups were watched. The Palmer Raids were intended to enforce laws in the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The raids grew into mass arrests and even into deportations. Ferdinando Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were both Italian-born American laborers. The men were also anarchists who supported violence as a way to protest government. The two were convicted of armed robbery and of murdering two pay clerks. Sacco and Vanzetti were both executed on August 23, 1927. Their trial and ultimate conviction are still a cause of controversy. The men claimed they were being discriminated against for both their race and their political beliefs. In protest of the executions, the anarchist group to which the men belonged bombed the Bank of Boston in Buenos Aires. The isolationist tendencies of America in the 1920s led to new immigration laws. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was implemented to check the flow of immigrants from Europe. Each year, a limited number of people from each country was allowed into the United States. In 1924, the Immigration Act replaced the Emergency Quota Act. The new Immigration Act only allowed a specific number of people to immigrate each year from various countries. This marked the end of unrestricted immigration into the United States. In 1919, the Boston police force decided to address the poor conditions they'd worked in. New officers had not received a pay increase for 60 years. The hours these policemen worked were long and demanding. The police force attempted to form a union but met with opposition from the government. When the Boston police did strike, crime ran rampant among the streets. Instead of meeting the police force demands, Governor Coolidge hired a new police force. In 1919, another major strike was that of the coal miners. In protest of low wages and long workdays, John L. Lewis called members of the United Mine Workers to strike. Despite a court order from President Wilson, the mines remained closed for over a month. The coal miners received a 20% wage increase, and John Lewis became a national hero. Unions and labor movements lost much of their power in the 1920s. World War I had changed the American workforce, and immigrants largely filled jobs in labor industries. The unions couldn't keep up with the various languages of this new group of people, and attitudes had changed. Farmers who moved to the cities to work weren't interested in relying on others to protect their rights, and the rights of African Americans, who weren't a large part of the workforce, were not allowed to join most unions. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was drafted by American Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand. The pact called for an international renunciation of war used as a national policy. Kellogg and Briand were hoping to pave the way for a more peaceful world, but the treaty was too idealistic to work. The pact failed in its original purpose, but was instrumental in forming later international laws. Conservation legislation of presidents such as Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson had led to the reserve of several oil fields in the West. These were to be used by the Navy only when other oil supplies were depleted. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed Warren B. Fall as Secretary of the Interior. Fall abused this power by secretly lending a few of the reserved oil fields to large oil companies. Fall was gifted $400,000 by these companies, and when the public caught wind of it, the scandal was huge and Fall was sentenced to serve in prison.